some of the technologies that we adopt here in Australia are still a little bit behind what they do in the US and in Europe, especially around, let's say, threat intel and that kind of, focus on the attacker and the tactics, techniques, processes of the attacker, versus here in Australia, we still, and I think, you can't not do it, but we still take that risk, governance, compliance, and apply technology to that.
You're listening to KBcast, the cybersecurity podcast for all executives. Cutting through the jargon and hype to understand the landscape where risk and technology meet. Now, here's your host, Carissa Breen.
Lani, welcome to the show. I'm really excited to have you here today. I think our good friend Scotty Fletcher introduced us a while back, actually, because I was chasing a topic which we are going to speak about today. And it's funny because before you and I spoke, it's kind of like I already knew you, but I had seen you a lot online. So really appreciate your time coming on the show today to talk about robotics. So before we jump into that, we always like to ask our listeners a little bit about their journey. So Lani, please talk to our listeners around where you sort of started and what are you sort of doing now?
Sure. And thank you, Chris. Look, the pleasure is all mine. I've been a long time follower of the podcast. So to get an actual opportunity to appear on it, it's very humbling. So thank you for reaching out. Now, in terms of my background, look, I won't bore the listeners too much into every detail, but over the last 25 years, boy, that makes me feel old. Over the last 25 years, I have been involved in what's now called cybersecurity. Think back 25 years ago, 1997, 98. I started in what's now called malware research, which is back then was called antivirus research. It was very rudimentary compared to what is being done now. Back then, it was very simple languages, disassemblers, etc. Signature file matches into AV, files, very, very basic, something that probably high school students could do with their, with their eyes closed these days. But, as with many, progressed through the security consulting path, working at both vendors and systems integrators, and also expanding outside of cyber into now what's known as more of that emerging technology field. So think IoT, the Internet of Things, smart cities, technology, AI, robotics, which is what we were talking about today. But primarily, it's always been through the prism or the lens of cyber. I took a bit of not really a detour, but something that is probably unusual in our profession is back in 2015, I graduated with a Master's of Psychotherapy, and people go, "You did what?" and what I usually try to explain is that, look, for me, right, tech is only interesting, and especially emerging tech, is only interesting in the context of people and how it affects our communities, how we improve our communities and society at large. To me, that's what makes it interesting. Otherwise, it's just tech for tech's sake. So graduated back in 2015 with a master's in that. I did it through, I guess, an interest in leadership, really organizational development and leadership. But, going through a cohort of 50-odd people, there were three of us who were doing it from that leadership stream. Everyone else there were, psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors, social workers. And so for the first 3 years, we all went through the same program. And then, the last year was our separate streams. And from that, I guess I fell in love with actually being a therapist, sitting with people, being invited into their life space, how they construct their worlds, etc. And so part-time, I volunteer at our local community center. And primarily I deal with, the sort of what I call the worried well. So stress, anxiety, loneliness, especially over the COVID period. I don't do much in trauma and sort of more of those clinical issues, only because I don't have the skills and I don't really have the time to spend doing that really delicate, complex type work. But in terms of what we're talking about today, it's helped me understand and give me more a holistic view on things like robotics, right? In terms of, it's not only the technology that's sort of driving it. It's also, there's the ethical lens, especially when you're looking at it in the context of, let's say, aged care or disability care, there's a huge part of where the people, empathy and that come into it. And for me, that just gives me that sort of holistic, sort of well-rounded approach to it. And it also comes in handy in understanding people in business, understanding people that you lead, connecting with executives, etc. It just, it better helps communicate, but also, if you're looking to influence, build relationships, etc. So I do that on the side, and people often go, "Wow, that's very different," and it is very different. Lately, I've probably spent a bit more time in the consulting world. So spent a bit of time in the Big Four consulting world, was recently a partner at Deloitte, leading their smart cities practice, and part of my cyber work, leading their critical infrastructure capability. And very recently, like in the last 2 years, have sort of dabbled in the startup slash VC, the venture capital space. So I helped co-found a cyber startup, Cybermetrix, which I sort of work from an advisory perspective. I don't really work in the business itself. And I helped co-found a venture capital advisory and firm called Azcende, which has a future of cities mandate. And again, it's more of an advisory role as an operation role. Unfortunately, I just don't have time at the moment between a full-time job at Claroty, running their ANZ region and doing all these other side projects. But that's, look, in a nutshell, over the last 25 years, Carissa, that's it.
Wow, that's awesome. I really like your journey. I really like how you've sort of brought in other things to enhance your current skill set. One of the things that really stuck out for me as you were speaking was talking around the context of the people. Would you say that most people in our space probably overlook that a lot? They really focus more on the tech rather than what the tech can do for people at the end of the day?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I mean, that was absolutely the case, let's say 10 years ago. It has improved. I think that, and again, I'll generalize, but I think society as a whole, there's been a lot more, of a conscious movement towards, even things like, gender equality, racial equality. And I think that kind of movement at that level has helped even in the tech space in terms of, I'll give you an example in the smart city space, right? Especially, I mean, I remember back in 2014 when I first sort of got into that space, a lot of it was just technology for technology's sake, right? Hey, we can have autonomous lawnmowers at the, at the showgrounds or whatever it is, just because we can. Hey, let's put, devices, in cities, cameras, etc., and connect them all up just because we can. Whereas now it's very much looked in the lens of, well, actually, how do we help our communities become more cohesive? How do we help and impact for the better society at large, how we work, how we live, how we play? And we've sort of now starting to take that lens and that route to when you're designing technology, designing processes, which I think is absolutely key, right? Because otherwise, as I said, technology just becomes tech for tech's sake, as opposed to actually helping people, helping communities, helping society as a whole.
Yeah, you're so right when you say that. I absolutely agree with those points. Let's talk about robotics. Now, before we jumped on, we were speaking around people's definition of robotics. So give me your definition of that so people know specifically what you're referring to, and that way we're all on the same path.
Yeah, that's a great question. And look, I don't think at the moment, right? People often go, "Hey, you're a futurist, Lani," and I say, "No, absolutely not. I'm not. I'm too practical and pragmatic for that." I always view it in the lens of what's happening when it comes to tech over the next 5, maybe 10 years at the most. And so, in terms of robotics, I really don't think at the moment you can really have a good conversation about it unless you talk about it in the context of its application or its use case. Is usually how I refer to it. Robotics to me as a whole, right? People often go, "Oh, they think of Star Trek, Data the android, and that's their idea of robotics." But really, it's to me, I look at it as a physical and digital system combined, and it can be as simple as a robotic arm at in a car manufacturing or a steel factory. Some people even define drones as robots. So I look at all of that, sort of under a broad umbrella. And then I look at it in terms of its use cases. How is it used? Industrial robots, that's easy to understand. I mentioned on the manufacturing plant line, simple things, robot arms, etc., packaging, etc. That is robots. Medical in terms of surgery, where they supplement a surgeon's skill to operate on patients, etc. Robot arms, I don't know if you've ever watched it, but there's a show on Netflix called Robot Wars where, for entertainment, we have robots destroying each other kind of thing. And then
oh my God.
Then there's the military and police sort of use case. But so there's probably not much of a definition as such, but I tend to look at it through its application and use case.
Yeah, so one of the things, first of all, I haven't seen that show. I'll have to check it out. But it's interesting when you speak to people within the industry. So when I mean industry, I mean IT more broadly rather than specific to security. I think they become perhaps a bit overwhelmed by it because maybe people think that robots are going to take over the world and all the crazy talk. So what do you sort of think about that? Like, can you sort of debunk that myth that people seem to carry a lot in the space, or even more broadly for people publicly listening to this episode?
Yeah, look, to be honest, I joke a lot around that, and people often think I'm serious when I refer to our future robot overlords. But look, I often say to people, they go, oh, what about, we've watched Terminator, etc. And it's like, yes. Isn't that what's going to happen when, 30, 50 years into the future? And I usually say, look, that's remotely possible, but it's highly improbable in terms of that's actually what's going to occur. And look, 50 years out, who knows what robotics, and especially when we start applying artificial general intelligence, not just machine learning and its different, techniques, deep learning, et cetera, that we have prevalent now. But when we apply artificial general intelligence, I tend to go, maybe not. I mean, there was that a few years ago, there was that famous letter that was signed by a whole lot of, Elon Musk, Stephen Hawking, Bill Gates, et cetera, showing their concerns around AI and where it was heading. I say, who knows, right? I'm really more concerned about the next 5 or 10 years. And I think in that next 5 or 10 years, we can do a lot when it comes to robotics to actually improve, human lives and improve our society as a whole.
So on that point, can you sort of paint a bit of a high-level picture of what's happening in the robotic space? Let's go with the 5 to 10 year mark.
Yeah. So again, right, it's let's look at its applications or its use cases. My primary interest when coming into robotics was more on the IoT side of things, as I mentioned earlier, the Internet of Things. And what I'm finding is that field of IoT and robotics are now beginning to converge, and it's been happening for a few years, still fairly nascent. And now it's called the Internet of Robotic Things, right? Which is primarily the differentiator is that IoT now, specifies that any robotics architecture. So let's think of it the most simple. Think of a robotic arm that's used in the automotive industry to help put cars together. As soon as you connect web services to that, connect to the internet, etc., it then becomes that Internet of robotic things. So that's one of the major trends, I guess, that's going at the moment. Things like its robotics visual systems, and it's that visual system integration into its sensors is always improving. For instance, cars, etc. Even I've seen CCTV cameras in terms of its use of a mixed mode of sensors like LiDAR, radar, visual and even audio sensory, and then on the back end that being mashed together in terms of in a data lake, using techniques like applied machine learning on the actual robotics itself. And in more sort of general speak, we talk about edge computing. What we're seeing now is a lot of that edge type computing, especially machine learning, is now being done at the edge, right? So rather than backhauling a lot of that into AWS, GCP, or Azure, there are companies like Intel, AMD, ARM, etc., who are giving the ability to do that at the edge, on the chip or on the actual robot / device itself. So that's happening as well. And I guess while I'm thinking of it, the most concerning use case I have in that space is that things like drones are now being outfitted with machine learning algorithms to do things like facial recognition, etc. So from a privacy perspective, that's a growing concern. But also when you think about from its use of robots / drones in military and policing, it becomes especially concerning. I don't know if you're aware of a story that's fairly recent last year. We're on the battlefield in Libya and even in Syria. Some of the combatants on the military field are starting to use drones, which actually carry munitions, weaponry, etc. Bombs is probably the most rudimentary, and then having those drones employ facial recognition to basically carry a small bomb directly into a soldier / soldiers, or if you extend that out, or targets. right? And there might be collateral damage, etc. And I guess the big difference there, right, is that at the moment with drones and its current use, is that the operator has to intervene. So the drone might, using its visual systems, identify a potential target, and then it will kick it back to the actual operator to make the decision. The operator doesn't usually make the decision. It usually, there's usually somebody there to oversee it. And, it might even go to a group or a panel of people to oversee it before the strike is approved. But at the moment, in terms of its autonomy and using facial recognition systems, I think the most concerning bit is that, right? Giving the ability for the algorithm to actually make the decision to, strike or not. And for me, that's a concerning. And that's, I guess, is one of the developments, especially in drone/robot technology, autonomous weapon systems. I think that is probably the most concerning thing for me around the robotics, sphere.
Yeah, that leads me to my next point, because I was just going to say, with all of these new sort of developments that are happening that are good, I mean, it can go either way, right? So you spoke a little bit just then around like the weaponry side of things. What other things from your sort of perspective does concern you when it comes to robotics? Because you are a realist, right?
Yeah. And I think, as you and I would know, right, technology is not really neutral. It's really how you use technology. I suppose, yes, tech can be neutral in terms of what it is, but again, its application and its use case would dictate whether that's for, that's destructive in terms of for society, or whether that actually makes a positive impact. And I think that is the military aspect of it is probably the most concerning for me. The other one is around policing, et cetera. I don't know if you've seen footage of, during the COVID era, there's a manufacturer, one of the largest in the world, Boston Dynamics, has made robots in the form of dogs that actually now start to patrol parks, et cetera, in the US, and can hand out fines, et cetera, if you were breaking curfew, et cetera. So, I mean, that again, right, there is definitely a positive aspect to it, or positive intent, but it really starts to skirt that fine line between becoming a police state and, imposing on your privacy, etc. So that the policing aspect of it is one as well. And I guess for me, it's not really robotics as such, but how AI is being, developed at the moment. I'm by no means an expert in the field of AI. I'm more sort of interested in the AI ethics of it, which I think is just as important as the actual algorithms and technology and the research that we are doing. And I guess for me, it's that is probably one of the other concerns, is when we start to fuse that into robotics, which can move fast, run fast, strike in terms of military and / policing. I think that's where for me it starts to get real concerning, and it's not far off, right? Again, Boston Dynamics, I actually did some work with that and a company called ABB Robotics. They're two of the largest robotic firms in the world. Some of their robots, yes, they take a lot of training to do, but I don't know if you've seen the videos of them doing parkour, et cetera. They're becoming very, very agile, nimble, being able to display extreme sort of dexterity as well. So from a physical aspect, that's one. And then when you start to sort of merge the intelligence into it, I think there could possibly be a concern down the track.
So that is quite concerning, especially about the dog situation. I'm sure. I wonder how that would go down in Australia. People are already going crazy about police, let alone robotic dogs going around and sort of issuing fines. Would you say, though, Lani, that we're sort of entering potentially into dangerous territory, because now, and you sort of touched on it before around skirting around the edges, is it going to be hard for people to navigate sort of that moral compass? And I mean, if you look at any sort of innovation or people that come purely around just developing something, they don't think about privacy and security and stuff like that.
Yeah, look, I always look at it through the lens of the culture that the context is in. Like, for instance, in the Western culture, I think, I hope that we would be more, I guess, vigilant against those kinds of uses for robotics. We are, Western democracies. We do have a vote ultimately in terms of what we do have a say in society. So I would like to think that we are, we have some controls that we can sort of apply around that. In some of the other countries and some of the other areas that don't sort of adhere to that sort of Western democratic model, yeah, look, it probably is a little bit more concerning. But again, right, the technology was originally developed, like those robot dogs that I mentioned, for instance, they were actually originally developed by Boston Dynamics for works in mines, and particularly when there are mine disasters. And rather than sending a team of humans down to save people who are trapped, you can send these robot dogs with video sensors, heat sensors, et cetera, on them to find people to rescue. So its original intent is good, right? But obviously that can be taken and used in other sort of applications or use cases as well.
So how do we sort of manage that then? Because yes, I totally understand what you're saying. Like I mentioned earlier, you can go either way in terms of using it for good or potentially using it for bad in some cases. So how do we sort of manage that then? And will it get to the stage where it just spirals out of control?
Yeah, look, I don't know in terms of you're asking for a futurist. I'm not one, but I don't know in terms of that future sense. But in terms of what we are doing now. A lot of it, there are the UN recently released a report, and there's a lot of signatories around the different countries, et cetera, where they're looking to restrict autonomous weapon systems. But unfortunately, other countries like China, Russia, and some of the other sort of countries in the Eastern Bloc have not signed it. So there are sort of work at the UN level in terms of let's all get agreement, a bit like nuclear disarmament. Let's all get agreement that we're not going to go down this route. Hopefully, from at a global perspective, that's that will have some push. And again, right, we've seen it done even at companies like Google. Sometimes just the pressure from the public or even the staff that work for the company pressurizes or applies pressure for the company not to go down that route, not to develop that kind of technology, and a bit like people power, so to speak, in inverted commas.
Do you think that works though? Because people can say I'm against it, but does that mean that people like Google, are going to deter them from doing what they want to say, irrespective of what the people say, perhaps?
Yeah, look, I think it can, right? Especially and we're going a bit outside the arena of robotics, but especially in the era of social media, and a lot of these large companies are concerned about social impact, et cetera. I think definitely it's an avenue, right? And I always look at it in terms of, look, it's better you try something in that regards than do nothing and allow people to go down a certain path they're already heading down.
I totally agree with what you just said just then. So on that front, because it is a security podcast, I would really like to talk to you about security for robotics. Are we sort of prepared for this at all?
Look, we're already doing work in that space, right? I operate in at the moment in the critical infrastructure space. So if I look at things like mining, which is covered under Australia's Critical Infrastructure Security Act that's being amended at the moment, they have been using robotics, in terms of crushers to crush iron ore, copper, and in terms of robotic arms to, sort out metals, etc. They've been using that for a while. And in terms of security, even though in the mining space, security has been a little lax, I would say, over the last decade, getting better. We've already started applying. I think it's been, largely just laissez-faire attitude, I would say, to security. I'm being a bit hard because actually mining, et cetera, has been probably one of the maturer sectors globally and even in Australia, right? Because they have such an emphasis on OH&S, occupational health and safety. I've found that, their high regard for that physical safety aspect has meant that they're probably ahead in terms of some of the other sectors. But sectors that rely on that sort of critical OT, what we call OT, operational technology, has generally been a little bit behind in terms of maturity around cyber than, let's say, financial systems, just because of the nature of it. And in terms of mining, right, if you think of a crusher, a robotic crusher, right, that crushes rocks and helps to extract metals or minerals, that will usually be connected to what we call a PLC, a programmable logic controller, which provides the digital interface to that robot, let's call it that. And then that is connected to an HMI, which is a human machine interface, usually a Windows machine. And then you apply your security controls to that Windows machine as you would endpoint, privilege access management, identity and access management. So we've been doing that in the mining space for a while, in the manufacturing space, for a while. And I'm saying for a while over the last 5 or 10 years. So cyber in the context of robotics has already been done. Some of the different use cases, though, are still fairly nascent. Drone technology, for instance, is a lot more immature because it just hasn't been around as long as mining in terms of that application and use case. So, I think I mentioned when we spoke earlier, I've been involved in a project for one of the defense contractors to actually look at underwater drone tech. So the use case is ordinarily for under warships, or you could even apply it to the private sector, under ships, large container ships in general. In order to check under the waterline, you would need to deploy a series of divers. It's not overly dangerous work, but there is a risk component to it. So as opposed to deploying a team of divers that may only be able to work, 2 or 3 days a week, let's say 2 or 3 weeks in a month, etc., they're starting to test and deploy underwater drones to actually do the checks of the ships below the waterlines, any damage that needs to be done, any weak sort of structural issues, using visual and also heat sensing. So any visual things to do around predictive maintenance, etc. So those underwater drones are fairly new, I would say the last 3 years at most. Now, securing that versus securing something like a crusher at a mining site, very, very different. So, when you're looking at a drone, the focus primarily is, so I look at it and there's, and you can apply, a security sort of reference architecture to it. I look at the risks on the drone itself to be probably a lot more higher than you would on something like a crusher that's connected to, let's say, a PLC. So the drone itself is obviously a combination of, motherboards, of chips, of et cetera, so firmwares. So that device security becomes a lot more important. The communication channel between, that and the human machine interface could be via radio, could be via, sometimes it works even over like things like BLE, Bluetooth Low Energy. And so those protocols are inherently not as secure. And so you've got to look at that channel as well. And then on the actual human machine interface as well that controls the drone, you've got to look, and that usually sometimes runs on a Windows machine. You've got to then look at security of that. So it depends on the use case, and it changes on that use case, and especially things like drones, which are a lot more newer, a lot more nascent.
So would you say that potentially, you've spoken about mining sort of leading the charge from what you've sort of touched on. Are we going to get to a stage where there's frameworks then perhaps so other industries and other sectors can start sort of adopting this sort of technology? Perhaps maybe that no one has done something in their space before. Maybe that's why that they haven't sort of adopted to it as quickly as other sectors like mining that you've sort of just touched on.
Yeah, and that's true. So if you're looking at drone technology, because it's fairly new, there hasn't been a standard for security in that, or even much reference architectures that are been ratified by like the IEEE or the standards association. But there are reference architectures out there. I think I mentioned earlier that there's a merging or a blending of things like the Internet of Robotic Things. So there are a lot of IoT reference architectures out there. The one I like to use is a local one from the IoT Alliance Australia. They publish a really good reference architecture to essentially map out from the endpoint, they call it, which is could be the device, could be the drone, the sensor, etc., right up to the industry solution, very, very broadly. But there's like 10 sort of domains in between. And so I like to use that. NIST have a framework that you can sort of make relative for robotics. So there are frameworks out there. You just have to take them and then use it in the context of the robotic use case you have, the application of it.
Yeah, sure. I understand what you're saying. And I guess sort of as time prevails, it'll become a lot more ubiquitous with like robotics in the financial sector, for example,
yes,
or whatever it may be. It's too probably early days to apply that to every single thing that we have at the moment.
Yeah,
so
it is. I mean, I will say it is flexible, right? So I use that framework for exactly mining as I've described, but there was also it was a very short engagement that I did maybe 18 months ago at looking at concierge robots. I don't know if you've ever come across. There are some hotels in it that you go into now here, and you have a little concierge that rolls up to you and says, hello, blah blah blah, etc. So we were brought on to. I think
Telstra's got one, don't they?
Yes,
we're in the Telstra building down in Melbourne there, and they had it. It was quite cute.
So there are those concierge robots. I applied using the same IoT Alliance framework to it, but because you put a risk assessment sort of lens over it, the way you apply it is slightly different depending on the use case. But yeah, look, we looked at it. The biggest weakness in those robots were a man in the middle attack in terms of the protocols that they used didn't have a very strong authentication in terms of SSL. And so essentially you could and unfortunately, because the engagement was scoped right down, we could only do a lot of theoretical. We didn't actually do the actual exploit, but we theorized that you could essentially do a man in the middle attack and then take control of the robot quite easily. But again, right, from a risk perspective, there's very low risk in terms of likelihood and impact if you were to, other than brand damage, et cetera, or even if you, one of the things that the board, when we presented the report was, but what if someone, took command of this robot and drove it into one of the dignitaries that were there at the hotel? So, yeah, it moves so slowly that, it probably wouldn't cause any damage, but yeah, you could do that.
I guess the risk is a lot lower compared to like a mine situation, the crusher, or
absolutely.
Going deep into water. Oh my God, that freaks me out so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely I'd be sending the robot in. I wouldn't be sending myself in. So on that front, in terms of like skill set, would you say that there are many people let's use Australia, for example, if you want to speak globally, however you want to position it in terms of security for robotics that exist out there?
Yeah, look, I would say that you could, especially the technical skills, absolutely there's a crossover and it can be applied to robotics almost immediately. As I said, if you've worked in the IoT space, if you've worked in even things like critical infrastructure, OT, industrial IoT, the skills that you have there from a security perspective are almost immediately transferable into robotics. And it would be like even the medical use cases, like, I did an assessment, this is about 2 years ago, on medtech equipment within a hospital context. And even then, in terms of the tools that we use to do the assessment and, the red team of their medtech, biomedical equipment, was basically the similar thing that what we used in most of our engagements. It's just the context changes a little bit. It took a little bit longer to actually get into the corporate IT network of the hospital and make a jump into their sort of trusted environment. But again, it's still relatively the same. So I would say from a skills perspective, the skills are in the market at the moment, especially the higher end technical skills. We just don't see at the moment in Australia the same use cases as they see in somewhere like North America or even in EMEA in Europe.
Why do you think that is?
I look at technology adoption. Australia, ANZ tends to be a little bit slower. I said the gap is closing. Having been in technology now for 25 years, the gap is definitely closing, but there still is, a bit of lag time there.
Why do you think the gap is closing? Like over over the last 25 years, you say it's closing, but what do you think sort of made it close quicker? Is there anything in particular that sort of springs to mind?
I would say globalization. That would, for me, that would be key, right? And the world has become, thanks to telecommunications, the internet, the world has become a lot smaller. And so technology adoption, where it took months, we were, let's say, 5 years behind 25 years ago, it's now very, very narrow, but adoption at scale is, in cyber, right? You've got a background in cybersecurity as well. Some of the technologies that we adopt here in Australia are still a little bit behind what they do in the US and in Europe, especially around, let's say, threat intel and that kind of, focus on the attacker and the tactics, techniques, processes of the attacker, versus here in Australia, we still, and I think, you can't not do it, but we still take that risk, governance, compliance, and apply technology to that.
So in terms of adoption, would you say that executives, in your experience or what you've sort of seen or people that you've spoken to are looking to sort of adopt robotics into their organization, even if potentially they're not from a mining or they're creating like weaponry or anything like that? Would you say that people are starting to think down those lines?
I think from a military perspective, yes, definitely. In some of the work that I've done with the large defense contractors, they are looking at it. The development is not done here in Australia; it's been done in the US. But the Australian Defence Force, etc., is definitely looking at that, especially like the Australian Naval research in terms of underwater drones that are used for good. I'll put in inverted commas, but also have a use case. So, a drone that clears a minefield, for instance, can easily be adapted to lay mines, for instance. So yes, that's definitely being looked at. But even in the private sector, I did some work for one of the largest grocery stores. There's two large ones. I did work for one of them that looked at. They were looking at implementing. I think they already have, right? Because this was about a year ago, and what they call an automated, warehouse, which is similar to what Amazon does with its warehouses, which is completely dark, but where they will have in the present they would have people going around picking for online orders, and your restocking comes in, etc. That warehouse might have anywhere between 50 to 100 people working in this dark warehouse, not open to the public, etc. But using one of the platforms that was developed out of Great Britain, a company called Ocado, it's completely automated. So, you have robot pickers that go to and fro from storage boxes, picks up the groceries, puts them in, in an order, etc. That gets picked up and shipped out completely. That 50 to 100 dark warehouse now becomes a warehouse of 5 people that basically maintain the robots, etc. So even in that sort of grocery/retail sector, there is a trend towards robotics.
Yes, that's definitely sort of what I was trying to understand. Well, I guess time will tell. It is still early days. So as things sort of roll on and as people can adopt to creating this innovation and understanding that they can develop robots for good, in inverted commas, then perhaps people will start thinking down those lines. So in terms of moving forward as a security industry, how do you think that we should better prepare potentially for this new age of robotics?
I think, look, it's being, and this is one of the benefits I find of our industry, is that because we are on that cutting edge of technology usually, I would say that we are really, really well placed. As I said, the skill sets that you require, I feel are already in the industry. It's just that we don't have a lot of, let's say, if I put my sort of supply side hat on, we don't have enough work to become really specialized in it at the moment. Right. But I think the rudimentary skills are already there in terms of the technical skills. And, you overlay, I was talking before about reference architecture, you overlay that architectural strategy lens to it, which we already have. And then on top of that, you apply your standard, risk, governance, compliance lens. If you're in the power industry, you're covered by by AEMO's AES CSF framework from a cybersecurity perspective. We have the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, which will cover robotics as well as as that. So I think, as I said, we already have it. It's just that we just don't have enough work, enough engagements to really specialize in that at the moment. But they will change. As I said, we are that gap that we have between North America, the EU, and ourselves in terms of technology adoption is closing.
And I guess once the demand is there, people with those skill sets that you referenced before will be able to sort of migrate and move across into those areas because there's that need or that high demand.
Yeah. I'll give you one other example. Really, really cutting edge is an area of robotics. It's called swarm robotics, right? Where you have miniature robots the size of, let's say, your hand, but you have hundreds of them. And what's being developed at the moment is trying to mimic what happens in nature. So if you look at, a flock of birds, how they fly, they all move, together. You might have 50 to 100 birds, but they all seem to move as one organism. Well, we're now trying to apply that to robotics, drones, etc. So military drones now, they're trying to build that intelligence where using, again, machine learning algorithms, the drones themselves, they mesh, instead of going back to command and control all the time, they mesh together and start to make decisions based on, parameters, etc. They start to make decisions on where to go, what to target, etc. So that area of robotics, swarm robotics, is really, really cutting edge. I don't know of anyone here in Australia that is, that specializes or has any experience of that. I certainly don't, but that will come,
you
though.
Sound like the closest to it, though.
only from what I wrote a position paper on it about a year ago, and that's about as close as I got to it. But that kind of, sort of leading cutting edge will eventually arrive. And then, as with everything, we will develop skills and get more experience, hands-on experience onto it.
Yeah, sure. No, I really appreciate you saying that, like a very, very pragmatic, realist response. So my last question for you, Lani, is what sort of advice would you have to executives on how to approach robotics if they're listening to this episode and they're started to consider it, even if they're not in those other sectors like mining, for example? And how would they then consider sort of security at the forefront of this?
Yeah, look, for executives, I would, if you take a business lens to it, depending on if you're looking at Forrester or Gartner, et cetera, I think robotics is expected to be nearly an $80 billion business by 2028. I think at the moment it's about a roughly 20 billion with a compound annual growth of about 20%. So even from a business perspective, for for board members, et cetera, and I've presented on robotics at board level before, it really is an opportunity for executives to take a hold of. And it's an opportunity for, even if you look at simple things like, it's an opportunity to make their businesses run more efficient, operations a lot more efficient, in terms of the number of people, even in terms of, the underwater drone use case I gave. Even for an occupational health and safety perspective, not having a team of divers, in the water all day, but having a robot do it. There's those business opportunities, to create new products and services to improve what you're currently doing and make it more efficient. So from a business perspective, if you approach it putting your business hat on, it would be negligent of you as an executive, as a board member, et cetera, not to find out more about it and see how it can be used inside your organization. Look at things like machine learning, or I hate to use the term, but AI techniques. About 5 years ago, it was not spoken about in executives or boards, but now every board that I talk to wants to know about AI and what's happening, because they know and they see and they've seen examples of it on how it can benefit their business, improve their profit margins, make their customers happy, etc. So if you approach it from that perspective as a business executive, as I said, you'd be negligent not to find out more about it and find out how it can improve your business.
I absolutely love that. And that is huge, 80 billion in 2028, which is not that far away, really, when you think about it.
No, yeah.
Wow, this is awesome. Really, really appreciate your time, Lani. Like I said, I've never had anyone on the show before to speak quite in depth about robotics, so I really appreciate your thoughts and your experience in the field. If people perhaps have a question for you that I didn't ask you, how can I go about getting in contact with you?
You can find me on Twitter or on LinkedIn. Just look for Lani Refiti and you can find me there. I'm always happy to connect with people, like-minded people, and share, collaborate. Because I think, if you look at those soft skills, I think it's in that collaboration, it's in that information sharing, which will help things like cyber within robotics.
Love that. Awesome, Lani. Well, appreciate your time, and I can't wait to get you back.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for tuning in. We hope that you found today's episode useful and you took away a few key points. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to get our latest episodes. If you'd like to find out how KBI can help grow your cyber business, then please head over to kbi.digital.
This podcast was brought to you by KBI.media, the voice of cyber.